You're sitting across from someone you trust, maybe over coffee that costs more than you remember, and they ask how things are going. You hear yourself say fine, automatically, the way everyone does. But then something cracks. Maybe it's the exhaustion. Maybe it's because they just admitted they're struggling too. You start talking about numbers you've been carrying alone, the rent that jumped $400 at renewal, the grocery bill that somehow hit $230 for basics, the mortgage payment coming due that you're already calculating around. And suddenly you both realize you're describing the same invisible weight. This thing nobody talks about at work or posts online, but everyone feels pressing down. This is Canada in 2026. Not broken yet, just bending. And once you see how many people are bending with you, the question stops being whether something's wrong and becomes what happens when this much pressure doesn't release. It shows up in your body first, before your brain processes the math. That flutter in your chest when you're standing in line and the cashier says the total. That split-second calculation at the gas station about whether to fill the tank or just put in $40. The way your shoulders tighten when your partner mentions needing new tires or the kids needing winter coats. These aren't dramatic moments. No crisis announcement arrives. But your nervous system knows something shifted because stress lives in your tissue now, not just your budget. Recent national surveys indicate more than half of Canadian households describe feeling financially anxious most days. Not occasionally stressed, not worried during emergencies. Most days. That's what changes first. Not bank balances, but baseline tension. The mental load of constant calculation. Tracking every transaction. Knowing exactly how many days until the next deposit. Mapping out which bills hit which paycheck, and hoping nothing unexpected lands in between. Families making $70,000 or $80,000 or even $100,000 a year, people who once felt secure, now describe the same sensation. Working full-time, earning decent wages by previous standards, and still running the numbers obsessively. This isn't financial illiteracy. It's the arithmetic breaking. When a household brings in $6,700 monthly after taxes, and $2,400 immediately disappears into rent. Another $600 into transportation, $300 for utilities, and groceries demand $500 minimum. That leaves less than $3,000 for everything else. Debt payments, insurance, phone bills, childcare, savings that never actually accumulate. The margin disappeared. Consumer researchers tracking spending patterns describe a collapse in discretionary purchases that happened gradually then suddenly. Over 3 years, the average household lost approximately $600 to $800 monthly in spending flexibility. Not because people got raises then stopped buying things. Because essential costs climbed faster than income ever could, and what used to be extra became what's needed just to cover basics. Restaurants became occasional. New clothes became rare. Entertainment subscriptions got evaluated one by one. Small luxuries that made life feel livable quietly vanished from monthly routines. But here's what the data actually reveals. Households aren't cutting back on wants to save for vacations. They're cutting back on wants because needs cost more than they have. National financial figures show that nearly 47% of Canadians are now carrying monthly credit card balances at interest rates exceeding 20%. That's not overspending on luxuries. That's bridging the gap between what life costs and what work pays, then paying compound interest on survival. The housing crisis everyone discusses in headlines lives differently in actual homes. It's a couple in their mid-30s explaining to parents why they're still renting, unable to articulate that starter homes now list at $550,000 in cities that aren't even considered expensive anymore. It's someone making $75,000 annually, solid middle-class income historically, being told by mortgage brokers they qualify for a $350,000 home in a market where almost nothing exists below $500,000. The math teacher doesn't work. Official housing data indicates the price-to-income ratio now sits at roughly 9-to-1 nationally, meaning the typical home costs 9 times what the typical household earns in a year. Economists point out that sustainable ratios historically hovered between 3 and 4 times annual income. What that spread represents isn't just numbers on a chart. It's an entire generation priced out of ownership not because they lack ambition or work ethic, but because the fundamental equation changed and nobody reset expectations to match reality. Renters face their own version of the same trap. Average asking rents for 2-bedroom apartments now exceed $2,400 monthly in major urban centers, with 1-bedroom units routinely demanding $1,900 to $2,200. Industry analysts tracking rental markets note that annual increases of 7 to 10% have become normalized across most cities. Compound that over 5 years and a unit that cost $1,400 in 2021 now requires over $2,000. Same space, same building, completely different affordability threshold. The pressure multiplies because moving doesn't solve it anymore. Vacancy rates across Canadian cities average below 2%, sometimes dropping under 1% in competitive markets. That means for every 100 rental units, fewer than 2 sit empty at any given time. Zero leverage for renters, no ability to negotiate, No option to shop around meaningfully because every alternative costs the same or more. What people don't talk about enough is the psychological tax of this reality. The constant low-grade anxiety of never quite having enough buffer. The shame of being employed, educated, hardworking, and still unable to get ahead. The exhaustion of maintaining appearances while privately drowning. Mental health data suggests a marked increase in financial-related stress and anxiety diagnoses over the past several years, particularly among people aged 25 to 45 who entered adulthood expecting stability and instead found quicksand. This is where the system strains beyond housing and rent into something more fundamental. When mortgage renewals hit, they don't just increase payments, they rewrite entire household budgets. Someone who locked in a rate of 1.9% in 2019 faces renewal at 5.5 or 6%. Recent lending data shows hundreds of thousands of households cycling through this reality right now. That spread translates to an extra $1,000 to $1,500 monthly on a typical $500,000 mortgage. Same house, same family, same neighborhood, vastly different financial pressure. And here's the compounding effect that makes this so destabilizing. Those households absorbing higher mortgage payments don't have discretionary income to cut anymore because they already cut it over the past few years dealing with inflation. They're already buying cheaper groceries, already skipping maintenance, already carrying higher credit balances. The mortgage increase doesn't hit surplus, it hits necessity. That's when people start making impossible choices. Delay medical appointments, drive cars longer, reduce retirement contributions to zero, pull kids from activities. These aren't dramatic failures, they're quiet surrenders to math that doesn't give. Official economic data shows household debt-to-disposable income ratios hovering near 180%. For every dollar a household has available after taxes, they owe roughly $1.80. That's among the highest ratios in developed economies. Consumer debt doesn't exist in a vacuum. It represents accumulated pressure over time, costs that exceeded income month after month until credit became the bridge. But credit isn't a solution. It's a delay mechanism. And the interest compounds while nothing else does. Young adults describe a different version of the same crisis. Independence isn't something they're delaying by choice. It's something they can't afford to achieve. Moving out requires first and last month's rent totaling $4,000 or more, plus furniture, utilities, groceries, transportation. Entry-level salaries ranging from $40,000 to $55,000 don't cover that leap while also managing student debt and building any financial foundation. So they stay longer, share tighter spaces, postpone relationships and families, watching the milestones their parents achieved at 25 slip to 30. Seniors on fixed incomes face the inverse pressure. Pensions and government supports that once covered modest lifestyles now fall short as costs accelerate. Housing that was paid off still demands property taxes climbing annually. Utilities that increase faster than adjustments, groceries that consume growing portions of fixed monthly budgets. Financial analysts note a troubling trend of seniors re-entering debt in retirement, carrying balances or accessing credit lines not for luxuries but for essentials their income no longer covers. Employment didn't fail these people. The equation failed them. Labor market data shows relatively strong employment rates. People have jobs. Many have careers. What they don't have is income growth that matches cost acceleration. Over the past 5 years, wages grew approximately 15 to 20% across most sectors. Essential costs, food, shelter, transportation, climbed 30 to 40% or more. That gap is everything because you can't budget your way out of structural mismatch. The construction industry tells its own version of this story. Housing supply shortages persist despite everyone agreeing more homes are needed desperately. Canada continues falling short by an estimated 70 to 100,000 units annually compared to population growth and household formation rates. Building isn't happening fast enough not because developers are lazy but because the entire system's strained. Labor shortages in skilled trades, material costs that spiked and never fully retreated, financing that became more expensive when interest rates climbed, municipal approval processes that stretched timelines into years. Each friction point adds cost, delay, or both. What emerges from all this pressure isn't collapse but adaptation. Consumer behavior research shows dramatic shifts in spending patterns that suggest permanent rather than temporary changes. Brand loyalty eroding as people trade down to cheaper alternatives. Shopping frequency declining as people batch purchases and plan meticulously. Retail categories like home goods, electronics, and apparel seeing sustained declines in traffic. Entertainment spending dropping year over year. These patterns don't indicate temporary belt tightening. They indicate recalibration of what normal means. Trust erodes too, quietly but measurably. Confidence in institutions, in economic systems, in the promise that hard work leads somewhere, all showing sustained declines in national polling. When people do everything right, education, employment, effort, and still can't achieve basic stability, faith in the system doesn't hold indefinitely. What replaces it isn't necessarily anger. Often it's resignation. Acceptance that this is just how things are now. Adjustment to diminished expectations. The most unsettling aspect isn't what's happened. It's what's still unfolding. As Canada moves deeper through 2026 and toward 2027, the pressures that created this situation remain firmly in place. Interest rates that elevated quickly haven't dropped meaningfully. Housing supply gaps that require years to close. Debt loads that compound monthly. Wage growth that can't catch up to cost acceleration. These aren't problems with simple solutions or quick fixes. They're structural mismatches requiring sustained intervention at scale. Projections from economic forecasters suggest additional waves of mortgage renewals ahead, potentially affecting over 2 million households over the next 3 years. Each renewal locks in higher rates, absorbs more income, reduces spending capacity elsewhere. That ripple doesn't stay contained in housing markets. It flows through entire economic sectors as household spending compresses further. Retail, hospitality, services, all dependent on discretionary income that keeps shrinking. What Canada faces isn't a temporary downturn that corrects naturally through market cycles. It's a fundamental repricing of daily life. Shelter, food, transportation, all reset at levels that exceed what median incomes can sustainably support. That gap doesn't close through optimism or patience. It requires either dramatic cost reductions or substantial income growth, neither of which appear imminent based on current trajectories. This crisis isn't defining itself through single catastrophic moments. It's defining itself through accumulated weight, through millions of individual households making impossible trade-offs month after month until survival becomes the achievement and stability, through young adults redefining success downward because traditional markers moved out of reach, through seniors re-entering financial stress after decades of security, through families working harder than ever and falling further behind despite doing everything conventional wisdom recommended. The system bent. It's still bending. How much further it can bend before something fundamental breaks remains the question nobody can answer with confidence. What's certain is this: the pressure isn't temporary, the math isn't improving, and the weight isn't lifting. This is what the cost of living crisis looks like once it stops being a crisis and becomes the condition. Not something that happened, something that's happening. And until the underlying forces change, this reality doesn't end. It settles, hardens, becomes the new foundation upon which everything else must somehow balance.